again, the structure within the customer service group, which really ended up giving us an avenue for redefining the metrics and kind of the composition of metrics that help us understand what those signals are. Identities, in different brands and different teams dedicated to those across this company, you'd have to do one by one really. So if we were trying to acquire new players, then you don't want a toxic environment being your front door, right? So we recognize that, but then it's how do we address that? What do we need to do? And our initial take on that was...
Hi, my name is Jochem van Veer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called TheyDo, the journey management platform for business decision-making. We raised over $50 million and are growing globally. Our enterprise customers include Ford, J&J, the Home Depot, and Pfizer. I mean, wherever you look, understanding customers is key to staying ahead. But in order to do this at scale, aligning so many different teams with the customer journey is incredibly hard, but it is possible. I really wish this podcast existed before we started our company because so many companies are organizing around journeys and there's so much to learn. So in order to share what I'm learning, what I'm hearing with our community, I meet with industry experts. And in my video podcast, I'm here to explore the world of business strategy, design, and journeys, customer journeys, to really get an understanding of how leaders are changing their way in their business. So let's dive into the show. So my guest today is Charissa Riddle, and she's the Senior Director of Experience Design and Customer Experience Strategy at EA, Electronic Arts. And it's a company I really love since I installed my first game of FIFA back in, I think, 94 on my computer. Yes, you had to install games back then. And she is a transformative design and customer experience executive with over 2 decades of experience leading global teams now at EA, but before at PayPal and at eBay. She drives experience design and strategy for the customer experience for over 50 million players, which is an insane amount of people if you think about it. Reducing toxic behavior, scaling digital self-service, and embedding customer insight into product and service decisions. Okay, and we're going to talk about strategic decision-making in many different ways today. Before where she is today, she shaped EA's customer service strategy from an operational perspective, but she also led the user experience teams. And she almost spent a decade at PayPal, modernizing operations and enhancing the employee experience. As you can tell, fluent in design, strategy, and operations, Charissa excels in complexity, aligning stakeholders, clarifying priorities, and turning insights into measurable impact while leading with empathy. How does that sound? I mean, this is phenomenal, right? So I am very happy that you are here joining me today, Charissa. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Yes. I want to dig right into something that is top of mind for me, top of mind for people listening, and maybe also taking us into a little bit of a history of customer experience itself, because in many organizations today, like leaders collapse CX into customer service still, right? I mean, it is considered something that we should deliver in just service, but in many organizations, customer experience is holistic. But when we collapse it into service, it breaks the system, right? So where do you believe that misunderstanding originates from? And how do you connect it without sounding like a preacher? I mean, that would be a wonderful way, I think, to set you up, to share a little bit of how you're thinking.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate the question. I think it starts with the source, right? Where did we originate trying to explain our proximity to customers and why that proximity was representative of the voices that we heard and the needs they had and what we can do about it? Because that came out of a lot of customer service organizations, I think depending on your relationship to customer service as an instrument of insight, that is, where people value or don't value that voice that we're trying to represent. I think that's it. And it's a real challenge, right? Even today, because while some organizations have customer service embedded with other teams and they start to really use that source as a way of understanding the customer need, others don't, right? Teams are still looking at ways to influence or change people's minds or opinions because of the proximity they do have. And they're trying to share their point of view and perspective, right? To get that influence across the board and change the decisions teams are making about what to improve. So I think that's where it comes from, right? It's our origin story. It comes from a CI or a customer service lens, and then we've broadened it over time because we know that there's more parts than that. I think customer service teams try and go upstream as much as possible because they realize that really the origin of the problems themselves are not theirs to resolve, but to identify. And I think that's really what's made it complicated for people to even know how to describe what customer service is separate from CX.
Right. And basically what you're saying is like, because service was the first one to receive the feedback or the signals that something fundamentally was broken upstream in the customer experience, they were the ones where this originated, which, I mean, sometimes in the early days of my career, I was jokingly saying, like, in Europe, we have customer experience that is thinking holistically about the customer experience. And in the US, we have customer experience that's just at the tail end of service, because in many organizations, because it originated there, it's coming from that place. And now we have all the tools to collect data on our own accounts for the different products that we're working on, the different services that we are embedded in. So the stack is either becoming more horizontal or more spread and therefore even more fragmented. So how do we think about customer experience? Is it even a department? Like, do you think of it as a department? Is it a function? Is it a mindset? Like, where do you land on that?
Yeah, I think it is a mindset. I think it can be a mindset. I think it can be a department. I think it can be, an organization. And I've seen it in all the variations. So I think all of those can exist that way. I think the most effective way is to think about it as a system, right? It is a interweaving of a lot of functions. Like, especially if you want to define the experience as all of the touch points that are relevant in the relationship you have with your customer. If you're saying that, then it's really big, right? And it's really broad. And it's a lot of teams and a lot of contributions that make that experience true for your customer. When you think about it that way, then it could be a process that supports that, right? It could be a team function that is in charge of unifying different parts of the organization so they know how to orchestrate their contribution they're making. It could be, again, a team who has ultimate responsibility for some aspects of maybe a part of the work teams or our leadership teams are trying to get people to focus on.
So you're saying it's because it's a system, it's almost like an internal capability, more so than it is actually something that is changing the way the customer experiences a product or a service, because that's like the responsibility of the teams delivering that part of the product, the service, where the customer experience system is actually putting the entire business together in unison to get from what the customer needs to positive business outcomes in place. So basically saying where our customer experience before used to be, hey, we're going to personalize this automation, if you will, right? I mean, we had journey orchestration for a bit, versus, hey, we're going to build a system that makes sure that product can tie what they're hearing from the customer to what the business cares about. So it's aligned with the strategy and everyone is working in unison. Is that what you're describing here?
Yeah, well, yes, and right. I think there are so many different aspects that generate an experience, and this is where it becomes an entire system. But if you think about the levers of an experience, and I have a working definition that I use for experience. It's basically a series of interactions that create an emotion, right? Because the outcome of an experience is typically shared in some evocative way, like that was great, that was terrible, I hated this was amazing, right? Those are all emotion words, right? And those are about the way that we feel about whatever it was that happened. And then you tend to recount the interactions that drove it. So if you're at a restaurant, it's the waiter was great, he was really late, he dropped the plate on my lap. Like, all those things are the interactions that create the way that you express your emotional connection to what happened, right? So when I think about that and we look at the levers that each team has to contribute to an overall experience, there's a lot in that, right? security teams have policy, legal teams have policy. You have, interfaces that are, in the product domain. You have different groups who have marketing responsibilities and the way that we talk to players. All these are different players, sorry, different customers, right? But that is really the composite way we bring all of those things together that we have individual responsibility for, right? But one by one, they are just a change in an email. When you put them all together, it is the experience across the interactions that we produce to make an engagement meaningful for the customer we're serving. So I think that's really what I mean, that whole system, there's all those pieces, and we have to kind of define where you want to make a difference and create something clear for your teams so that you know what your entry point is, your exit point is. Is it everything, or is it something specific that you're trying to address to help make an improvement?
I love that. It's a strong definition that also implies, and I'm curious to hear your point of view. It also implies like the purpose of customer experience is to create an emotion, depending on what type of business you're in, what type of emotion it is. A lot of customer experience teams feel that they lack the ability to create impact. They feel that they're reporting on what has happened, and they want to realize impact, right? But to do that, you need to speak the language of the business, need to tie it to specific business outcomes. But the business is not necessarily there to say, hey, we are here to create an emotion. Now, maybe in your company that's different because you're serving gamers, but maybe drawing from like how it was at eBay or like at PayPal, I can imagine that's creating almost like a polarization, right? Customer experience is all about emotion. The business is all about results, about the KPIs. So they are almost at odds. How do you think about marrying those two?
Yeah. Well, and real quick clarification, I'm a former employee of EA, so everything I say here is with that in retrospect. But I think you have different groups who care about different aspects, and this kind of speaks to even the metrics we use to encapsulate what we care about, right? But you might have a brand team who cares about emotion all day long, right? Because loyalty is driven by the emotion and that connection that you have to the brand that you're interacting with. I think there are other teams who are looking at retention or whatever your primary drivers are: acquisition, retention, engagement, monetization, whatever it might be, right? Those are your typical business drivers. I think when we don't bring those things together and help us understand that an emotion matters, a leading indicator of some kind matters, a lagging indicator of some kind matters, bringing those things together to help you understand the health and effectiveness of your business or your change or your project or whatever. I mean, the scale doesn't matter. It's all very similar in terms of what you're trying to understand when you're trying to make a change or recommend something to optimize whatever the experience might look like or the parts of the experience might look like. So I do think there is that chain that exists that makes it more meaningful, right, when you're making decisions about what to do.
It's interesting that you're bringing up loyalty. I mean, completely different industry, but what I know in car manufacturing, right, in the automotive industry, loyalty is a big indicator for repeat purchase. Okay, so we measure loyalty, and we know like if loyalty is increasing, that will ultimately translate into car sales. It's pretty generic. I mean, there's more to it. So what drives loyalty? And they know great service drives great loyalty. And because if you're a car owner and there's something wrong with your car, not like your regular maintenance, we have an opportunity to not only meet your expectations, but also exceed it, which creates that like brand affection, right? Which ultimately can be measured through loyalty and will result in car sales. And how is that in a gaming company? Like, how is that different to maybe what you've seen in companies that focus on merchants or on a marketplace like eBay? So is there a difference? Like, is that a different way that you think about how experience materializes, how things like loyalty help for creating more revenue or tying it to the emotional outcomes? Like, is there a difference in how a company that's serving gamers versus like serving a different type of persona is thinking about experience in general?
I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so, but I think there are different moments that the emotion arises, right? So in in that car situation, for example, I mean, I think you have kind of two components of emotion. Hey, my car is doing what it's supposed to do. I'm happy I can drive it. I feel secure and safe that it's going to get me where I'm going, right? Or where I want to go from here to there. If it breaks down, how disappointing. But if I have a good service experience that gets me in and out and back into my car as quickly as possible, how great, right? And now I feel like I've been seen and heard by the service department who knows my time is valuable and is willing to get me back in my car, right? As much as they can. Well, in gaming is really similar, right? Because if you are playing your game you want to play, you don't want to get bounced out for any sort of reason at all, right? And the longer you're out of the game, the more frustrated you are. And so if you have to go into like a customer service loop to get back in the game, and we've been able to show that, I mean, ultimately, people who contact you are the people who care most about your product, right? Because they care enough to make the time to get back to your product, even though there's a friction moment that's preventing them from using it. So we know that, right? And we know that there's frustrated because they care and they're passionate about that. But when you can resolve it, they get back in the game and they're happy, right? Like, hey, that was great. I got back to what I wanted to do, was to be in the game in the first place. So much like the car, I think there's something in gaming that's equivalent, right? But I think, at the end of the day, maybe this is a different this is a different answer to another question, right? But I think there is the use case of breaking in the first place is the one nobody wants to be a part of, right? And maybe this is even an answer to your first question. It's like, why is it a hard source for us to have the customer service be the place for how we're trying to shine a light on opportunities for change? It's because really we're the use case that, we're the broken use case, right? We're not the ultimate happy path. We're the path that is the place you go when something goes wrong that you wish didn't go wrong. But if it did go wrong, you want it to be satisfactory in its resolution? So I think if we can do that, we can improve things and recover the relationship, but you don't necessarily generate relationship from that, right? What I think you generate relationship and emotion to is the connection to the expectation in the first place. This is playing the way that I want it to. If it breaks, can they make me happy to get back in the game so I'm playing the way I want to?
Yeah. But that's I think the critical piece, right? Can I get people back into the game, right? Which is like obviously like important for bringing your gamer back into the ecosystem. So when we think about customer experience in the broadest sense, you've said that CX loses power when the definition gets too broad, which is something that I picked up when doing research before this call. So how do you create a definition that's wide enough to guide companies the size of EA, but still narrow enough so that teams can actually act on this, so that we're not getting all these signals from service where it's like this is broken and that is broken and becomes like a recurring reporting capability and a signaling function, and then everyone looks at the data and says, okay, great, but we have other priorities. So how do we make sure that we have customer experience defined so that the whole company is like able to take what you're seeing and then act on it, but it's also following through on what they say is important?
I mean, maybe let me break that down a little. So, starting at the how is it too big? How does it get too big, right? I think when we have high aspirational statements, it's one of those indisputables, right? Like, I like babies. Okay, great, right? I want peace. Sure, I do too. Let's solve world hunger. That's great, right? Of course. But it gets down to well, how do we want to do that? Where the debate happens or the, division happens. And you may see that pattern in lots of places, certainly not just business, but definitely in business too, And I think that's what I mean when I say it's too big. Like if you say something like, I want to improve the experience, sure. Who doesn't, right? But you have limited resources and you have limited attention, right, to fix something. Then how do you find the most important part of an experience? And how do you agree on what that part is so that you can actually action it? So for me, there's something between the experience intention or aspiration into something tangible that lets the team figure out exactly how to solve something, right? I like the experience strategy for that. It's essentially a dissemination of it's the scope, right? It's saying, here's my start and entry, or my entry and exit. Here's what we mean by an experience, because there can be multiples or journeys or whatever language you want to use to describe it. But there is a container that you're trying to identify and make an improvement to. You want to be able to measure that container somehow so that you know what your before and after looks like. And you can tell that the things you introduced either affected or did not affect something, and you want to be able to pull that down into a funnel all the way down into a document or some form that a team knows how to actually take action around, right? And it can't just be improve the experience. It's got to be improve this experience A with these tactics in this measurable way that's going to show this outcome and make this kind of difference, however that's defined for you.
So, spicy question. Who owns the container? Who drives the outcomes? Who is accountable for it? I mean, I'm with you if you call it an experience or break it down by journey. Some organizations do it by job to be done. But what is really hard, because typically these are like highly cross-functional by nature, right? To get something done, you need a lot of teams to do their part. So it's easy when you say, like, I'm in the service department, we need to improve our resolution time, and we're going to have a little training program to do so. Wonderful. But that's not really what you're talking about, it sounds like. So we have the container, which is like a part of the experience, a part of the customer journey. And you have the signal. You see there's something broken. So what have you found to be useful ways to say, how do we create accountability across different teams that all show up to make that experience possible, or to own pieces of that journey that collectively can drive action? Is it as simple as like assigning specific drivers or owners for those containers, quote unquote? What have you seen to be working at scale?
Yeah. Well, at scales, maybe the interesting
I just
question.
weave that in at the end quickly.
I'm like, at scale, like all of a sudden, like, But I can tell you, this is what I think we need to do, right? Because you asked who's responsible. I think CX practitioners are responsible. I mean, this is partly the quest we're on, why there's some confusion between, is it a customer service type of advocacy, or is there something broader than that? I think that's what we're talking about. Well, who is responsible for that broader pattern? We're trying to break down and figure it out. I do think there has to be a common way to see the thing we're trying to improve. I think hopefully there's some governance of some kind where decisions are made. Who's making the decisions about which projects need to be addressed? Who is that in your organization? You find that mechanism, then I think you start to define your project by a container, right? And I think you can pitch your project by that, by those elements we're talking about. Like, hey, here's what we see. Here are the signals that we've identified. We think this is the container we think has relevance for the business. This is why we think that's true, right? Whether you use metrics that are in the business language or not, or there's a customer language that's, your way to advocate for it, whatever it might be, but you're telling a story on behalf of something that you see as valuable, right? And I think you have to find where those decisions are made to make that possible. And I really think it's why everybody tries to go upstream, right? You're going upstream, trying to find where does it start? The origin of the work itself. But, I think we look for that because we're trying to figure out a way to frame it in a way that then lets us figure out, well, okay, if this is the container and here are the parts of that container and these are the teams responsible for those parts, that will actually help us get those right players in the room earlier to have the conversation about how to address this together. So I think that's really what we're all trying to do in some shape or form. We just, some of us don't get to the table in time, right? And we're really trying to get there so that we can, I guess, feast together.
Well, one of the tools obviously is using the journey map for that, or revealing like what the customer experience is like, where the friction points are. The thing that I see teams digress from, like actually then start to use it and making that impact, is that the part that we have control over are the voice of the customer, the research we've done, the service that are getting into, the call logs that we're getting. So all like the customer pieces. But then we need to get the metrics in. Then we need to understand who owns the KPIs, who actually measures it, who has access to like the correct data, right? And that's where we sometimes get like a lot of friction from the organization. It's not my priority. I will not help you. And then we get like this journey that is like very real for what the customer part matters, but it's not really rooted in the business reality. So I've seen over and over again, go all the way up to the leadership. We have that journey there. Everyone stands around it or sees it or gets presented to it. Crickets, because it's not rooted in reality. So I'm really curious, like, what actually shifts the mindset of leaders, of people who are making the decisions when they're looking at the journey? Like, maybe the obvious thing is like it has to be their KPI that's in there, but I'm sure you have a more nuanced way of helping different business leaders, different parts of the organization to start rallying around the journey. So I'm curious to hear, like, what has
Yeah.
worked? Like, what are some examples of how you've actually pulled that off?
Yeah. I mean, I really think it depends on the leaders you're working with and how you speak to them and the language they care about, right? EA, for example, is a very story driven, narrative driven organization. I mean, so in many ways, being able to connect to the empathy of a player is highly important, right? Versus maybe a PayPal, or at least in PayPal when I was there, the financial drivers could be really an important element of having that connection to the decision makers so that you can get that work moving forward. But I do think that, in particular, especially on the narrative driven pieces, have you ever heard the book Made to Stick? It's quite old now, but yeah. What I love about that is it's making something tangible. And I think that's essentially the effort here. Like, how do you create an empathetic connection to what happens for your customer? Something indisputable. Like, you just can't ignore it, right? The things that we did that I think have been most powerful for that is the showing it. Like, a lot of the times that your decision makers aren't necessarily your own customers, right? I mean, we have a lot of executives who may or may not play the games that they're responsible for helping lead. So, how do you help them see what the players of these games are experiencing, right? And sometimes we show it on maps, but we actually show screen by screen because the screen by screen becomes that aha moment of like, oh my gosh, why are we doing that? Or we're putting two different lanes on the page so you can see, well, here's where the email comes to the person who was just banned, or the promotions coming to the person who just bought it at full price. Those are really weird, disjointed experiences, right? Like, how frustrating to get the discount after you paid for the whole thing. You don't want that. So how do you show that those things are the small little paper cuts that really create a problem overall with the feel that customer has with the relationship with your product. So I think we try and make it as tangible, as evocative, as indisputable, as like I said, in your face, like, oh, I can't ignore it. Because if I can't ignore it, that means it needs to go somewhere, and we need to do something about it.
Does your story always follow the same pattern? Like, do you have like a narrative arc that you've developed that works, or does it really depend on who you have in front of you? Like, how you start to tell that story? Like, I see you nodding for people who are watching us on YouTube. Like, curious to hear. But like, what is your approach to storytelling?
Yeah. I think, I mean, I guess my answer is yes. Do I have a pretty typical one, but does it also matter who I'm speaking to? So yes, is the answer. But I do think there is I mean, mine tends to be very much on the customer side. This is the problem or the opportunity. Let me show you from the customer's perspective. This is how they are experiencing something, and this is why it matters to the business. So there's something in then connect it to the business domain that's relevant. If we address this, here's our opportunity, or this is what it can look like different, or here's how we've already tested that difference. And let me show you the impact of the change. Somehow, in one way or another, being able to show that, like, I mean, especially in the world of designers, right? We have these tools that are in proximity to the customer, right? That let us understand and hear firsthand what they're actually experiencing. So use that, right? So if we can show like, hey, we decided to A/B test this or multivariate test this because we knew there was something here that didn't land right. And here are the results. Let me show you that, right? But again, tangible, right? Moving away from just the story, just the emotion, to the impact of it. I think you have to know what the problem is, how to share the problem, how to share the impact, or how to at least evaluate or investigate that impact in a way that's going to show a result.
Are you always starting with the customer? I mean, in design school, we were trained like start with the business challenge, and then you are going to connect it to the customer needs and work from there. Like, do you always start with here's what my customer is experiencing, here's what is not right about that, and then here's why it matters to the business? Is that always how you start?
Yeah, pretty much actually. I mean, well, there is, so we introduced this system that I thought was very valuable. So it kind of a it was a deconstruction of the organization so that we can get away from the trickiness of words, right? So again, if we were trying to improve experiences, I'm like, great, which ones? Tell me how to get to a place that we are actioning that experience, right? What level do I need to, or elevation do I need to get to make it clear the change and the difference, right? So we are looking for signals, and those signals can be not just a customer, feedback or voice. There's signals of other kinds out there that help us know how to dig into something. So we created essentially an atlas to help us classify our entry and exit points, and then we looked for the signals in that we call them journeys, and they're sub journeys and things like that, to again give us a language structure and a hierarchy that helped us to define the system. And then we look for those signals, and then we connect it to the player, and we essentially call that the wayfinder, right? Like, what is the beacon that we're following to understand what that player is experiencing so that we can improve it. So it can start somewhere else, but it is always rooted in the reality of the player experience itself. Like, if you know what I mean? So I mean, even if there was a big business problem to solve, if the customer impact or difference didn't have relevance, it'd be like, well, I don't even know how, maybe those things can't even be separate. Maybe that's not even possible. But I do think the connection to the person experiencing it is very important for us to understand so that we can get it right when we're trying to address it.
If you're enjoying this conversation, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast channel and leave a review. It makes all the difference. The Experience Edge podcast is where I interview business leaders, CX pioneers, and the best designers who share their insight on creating business impact, having an edge on the customer experience. Do you want more exclusive content and behind-the-scenes access? Check out the Experience Edge podcast on YouTube and LinkedIn so you don't miss a thing. Now let's get back to the conversation. I love to geek out on the Atlas, if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
Because that structure, like, I'm seeing this over and over again in many organizations. So how do you do it in a gaming company? Like, do you have a journey framework, a journey atlas for everyone who plays FIFA, to everyone who plays fill in the blank game? Are there like common journeys that cut across all of them? Like, how did you structure that? Like, and to what level of abstraction are you going? Because you talk about the gamer as if there's like an individual journey, almost like a user flow that is at the bottom of this. Like, that sounds like for 50 million people, very complicated to do. So talk to me a little bit about how you structured it and how you landed across different games on what was useful.
Yeah, I mean, what makes EA in particular complicated is that you have a lot of studios and specific games that each studio is responsible for. So there's this kind of bouncing back and forth between a central team's responsibility and the specific application in studio and relationship to studio that you have to connect to or address. For us, we started in the customer service organization, which really allowed us, even by contact reason, a way to say, here's a structured organization already available to us. So we started there, right? Because here are the reasons that different teams or people are coming in against the title that we can structure and organize in a way that gives us a hierarchy. So that was a very helpful start. Now, when we tried to take that further and then apply it to a studio by studio lens, that gets more difficult because, the central teams aren't responsible for a specific studio's way of defining itself, right? We're responsible for some handshake in there. So trying to figure out what that needed to evolve into, that has and probably will be challenging for a long time. But I do think you can do that with different parts of the business. You can still talk about that with marketing, right? Again, emails and your channels and your different places. Like, what is it that you like? Are you defining your experience by channel? Like, or, and if it is a channel, is what is your touch points within the channel? What are your timing and cadences within that touch point? Like, what is the message you actually are trying to communicate? There is a way to get from the the time cadence, like the location, the cadence, the language again that you're trying to produce. So that's what we were pursuing. Most recently is the broadening that beyond the customer service lens where we're already centralized. But that's a challenge. I mean, it's just a real challenge. It's really, we were looking at journey management because it's got that opportunity, but because we have different identities, and different brands and different teams dedicated to those across this company, you'd have to do one by one, really, and that becomes highly inefficient for the central team, but effective for the specific, studio that you're supporting. So that's where it always becomes like, man, that becomes big. That's really big or inefficient again for one side of that transaction. But we have, I think we've done an incredible job at trying to get a sense of again, the structure within the customer service group, which really ended up giving us an avenue for redefining the metrics and kind of the composition of metrics that help us understand what those signals are.
Changing the composition of metrics because you have the atlas. Like, how does that happen? Like, what
Yeah.
happened that made you question like the way you measure or the way you structure KPIs for the organization?
Yeah, well, I think it was a move from a metrics driven kind of definition to an experience or a journey driven definition, right? But if I can say, hey, I don't know, contact reason one, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever it might be, but this is why somebody's coming in. Here's the reason they're here. Here's the, typical duration. Here's what they're looking to solve. Here's our ability to solve it one way or another. And we can actually chart all of that, right? And that becomes now an experience that we're trying to evaluate in some way. Like, is this going to change if we address it? As opposed to, right, starting with metrics that are like, well, is first contact resolution the right thing to do? Or is a customer satisfaction score the right thing to do? Because in aggregate, that can tell you how the functional health might look, right? Or the efficiency might look, but it's not actually giving you a lot of insight about what's happening for the customer in that specific task that they're trying to get resolved. So it let us build from the experience outward to the metrics and then into a composite one that was really more of a, kind of based on the dimensions of satisfaction and feeling and time back to game.
I love that. And I think this is critical. I know a lot of organizations that have like this contact reason model, which they believe is the holy grail for good reason. But it's, to your point, it's a starting point because that contact reason is part of an experience. Like a customer, a gamer, a person is trying to do something, has a problem, and that is the reason that they contact you. Whether it's like, oh, I want to sign up for this thing, I want to try it. But the contact reason is just always part of something bigger. So what you're saying is, that's the way we used to measure it. Now we realize like the experience around it is what we should be caring about, where the contact reason is still part of it. We should still do the basics like counting and making
Of
sure the
course.
resolution time is as low as we can, but measuring that end-to-end experience for this particular contact reason or everything that's around it becomes then possible.
Yeah, exactly. And really, again, there's different views, right? And this is true for so much of what anybody in the business world understands, right? It's like there's different views depending on what you're trying to address, right? Because at a functional level, if you're going to look at the overall health of your contact center, for example, right, there are some metrics that absolutely matter that aren't necessarily tied directly one-to-one to every task of, a customer may be coming in to complete, right? And that's important for the leaders in driving efficiency and, decreasing and redundancies or whatever, all the other elements that are true in any sort of customer service domain. That still matters at a functional level. But if you're trying to improve the connection to your customer and making sure you're meeting their expectations and getting them back into the product that they love because something went wrong that is not allowing that to happen, then how do you measure what that is in a way that brings you back to the source, right? In a very, again, tangible and applicable way that you can package up and go, if we can improve this upstream problem that is connected to this thing that we see in the experience we've just defined, that will make a difference for the game, for the company, for the player,
There's a very big difference between what's useful and what is usable, right? What we are seeing in your example even, oh, we want to have a contact reason based journey atlas that spans all the experiences, and then for this studio it's like this, and then we go to the next studio and it's like that, and then each of the studios has a different setup. So what's useful is that everyone has their own, it's complete, it's filled with all this experiential data, it's filled with the signals, it's tied to the metrics, everything is great. But it's not usable because it's too complicated and it's impossible to manage, right? So it's really hard to do this in practice and make the right trade-offs for your organization. I mean, it sounds a lot like a Fortune 500 company with multiple brands that have nothing to do with one another, just are part of that big thing. And we want to create synergies by unifying customer experience, right? Like boardroom strategy, big one there for the next couple of years. But in practice, it's almost impossible to do. So if you had to do it over again, like new organization, or even like do it again at EA, what would you do differently or the same? Like, what are some of the ways that you think about teams, setting up them, organizing around experience, making it usable for the business that you've had to learn through trial and error? Like, what would you do differently, or what would you do the same?
I mean, it's funny. I mean, you talk about you're exactly right. There is a huge tension between, each brand or each game, it's its own brand, right? And so that's a kind of an evergreen tension. But if I were to do it differently, I mean, I think you have to do it brand by brand, because the needs of each one is different. And I think the tension is the central teams, again, look for efficiencies and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to be different and unique for each group I'm working with. That gets very challenging and complex for those central teams. So I think if I were to do something again, I think it would be a different governance structure. Honestly, I think it has to there's got to be some central way to identify the best opportunity. There's got to be a way to advocate for the opportunity that you think needs to be improved from kind of your source or your perspective. Some way to bring the teams together at the same time that unifies their objective to a common objective instead of doing it siloed or piece by piece, And I think that starts at the decision-making process. That starts where we make investment. Like, what are we going to focus on this year? One, and this is just a pet peeve, priorities should never be an S. It's priority. Priority means it's singular, right? And we know that, but we have a lot of work to do all the time. And our attention's always fractured all the time because we're trying to do all the things that we think can be improvement. But I think choosing something that is a wrapper for that, like, hey, we want to double our memberships. We want to, decrease churn by 25%, whatever it might be. Give the team a something, and here's the runway you have to do that. I think defining things by experience so you can get to that language. So I would introduce that language early and I would put it in the strategic planning process, and I would make sure that the teams know how to actually interact in that space so that they can get the clarity they need to go pursue and test and figure out the right solutions that are going to make the difference. I think I would do that, advocate hard for that.
Yeah. So it starts actually with the business, because I can imagine there's all these game studios. Everyone has their different journey atlas. Everyone is understanding their customer experience. But then the broader business needs to do churn reduction, or that's one of the key strategic objectives for the year. And all of a sudden you have a lens that unifies the studio, says, okay, well, how are you going to contribute to that? Like, what opportunities do you see in your customer experience that would help that? And all of a sudden, you're creating that leveled playing field, but you're respecting each of the studios and its gamers' own needs and saying, okay, your job, collectively, we want to reduce churn or we want to increase dot, dot, dot. How are we going to do that systematically? How are you going to bring opportunities that are in line with that? And that is, I think, like a very useful way to do it. You can have coexisting but completely separate experience frameworks, thinking about what is relevant for that specific game or brand, if you will. But then together as a company, we show up to collectively take action against something that we all prioritize against. And then you can still have this whole debate on what's more important than the other. So you create one priority, like you said. I mean, wouldn't that be easy? But that's I think, a good way of doing it. But the flip side is you start from the business, right? You don't start from the customer anymore. I mean, of course, you can start from the customer, but also for storytelling, it's like, okay, we're going to prevent churn or we're reducing our churn. Here are some things that I'm seeing in our customer experience. So it requires us to definitely start with the business. So again, back to the tension, like, do you think that's the right way?
Well, I kind of think that's a false premise because it is it can start with the business. I can be a business leader and say, hey, look, I'm seeing, drop off rates or my retention is terrible. And, I need this up 25%. That could be true, right? I could also go and show you, hey, here are all the problems players are having and by a different data set from something maybe you don't see. And I'm going to talk about it that way. We need some place to rationalize the objectives and create clarity on what we're trying to do. Now, so meaning I could be an initiation of an effort of some kind. Now, maybe we level it up and say, oh, that's a churn thing. The way I'm going to communicate it is going to be a goal. And that goal is going to be a 25% change in X, right? And that is what we do in business to help align teams to drive certain change, right? But it doesn't mean it started there. It just means that's the way we communicate down to make that possible, you know? So anyway, I think that, where you can find your things that you want to make an impact with doesn't necessarily start with a goal. It can start because you identified a signal that now turns into one.
So let's double click a little bit on decision making, because there are the known rituals, right? We have our quarterly planning, we have our annual OKRs, we have our dot, dot, dot. There's a couple of those critical ways, company-wide rituals that we use for our decision making. But that's like 20% of them, right? The other 80% happen like between conversations and behind closed doors and in different meetings and just happen for no reason. Which makes it really hard to get a grip on this, right? I had Maxi Schmidt, I don't know if you know her, from Forrester on, and she always says like, hey, the number one journey you should always map out is the decision-making journey in your company for whatever part of the business are. So you probably have done a few of them. So how do you help teams that do not necessarily know how to tie to the decision-making rituals? Like where should they start in a highly complicated enterprise organization when we think about starting to influence decisions from the customer experience? How do we understand where to do it other than like the next product increment that we can all, get our features prioritized?
Yeah. I think you start with a single framework and try and stick to it, right? Because I don't know if it really even matters which one, but if you want to use customer data as a source, for example, right? And the leadership team's like, okay, here's the way we're going to look at improvements in identifying the projects that we think matter. We're going to look at these 5 sources, and it's going to be our customer service data. It's going to be our telemetry and data analytics. It's going to be, our marketing sources, and we're going to bring those to the table, and we're going to deep that in what are customers doing, wanting, and expecting. I don't know. Right. And now we're going to make some decisions on, is this meeting it? Is this meeting it? Is this meeting? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Right. And I think that we have to have a system like that versus a mixed model of sometimes it's the executive's preference. I think this is a good idea. Here's something I think I would like to do. We've been doing that for years. Let's continue to do that. Let me put that in the mix. And then what you get is this kind of hodgepodge of direction to teams that even complicates what you're talking about further. So, and that's where you get 15 different priorities, right? Oh, here's a space, here's a measure, here's an objective, here's a whatever thing. And then all of a sudden you got hundreds of projects that proliferate projects because there's no structure. And to your point, 80% of the things that end up happening is activity based on intention from that initial direction, but there's no management on the choice itself, you know? And I think if you can do that, then I think if you can create some structure, then you can do something like, okay, here's in this effort, we are only so mature. Let's say we are like really, really young. And so if we're really young in this place, well, we probably need to do some testing. We need to do some exploring. We need to navigate the, feedback that we're looking for to really distill if this is worth doing or not. If this is a thing that we've known about for years, we just haven't gotten to, we have a really strong understanding of it, well, that's a more mature concept, right? You can move that into a different state of working and then again, put a container around it. What is your definition of done for this thing so that you know that you've hit it or didn't, or you have to let it go or you're going to move forward. But having that in your structure and how you're making decisions, I think is imperative. And again, I would agree all day long that the first thing to map out is how those things flow, like how work flows through your organization, how the decisions of those work items move through your organization, because that's when you're going to find out like who are the teams making those decisions and who is connected to those groups, because even that can be right. You have your marketing team making some, you have your security team making some, you have your engineering team making some, and lo and behold, they need each other to execute most of what they've just decided on in isolation to get done. And I know a lot of teams use shared goals and things like that, and that's okay, but they kind of come to those late, right? Like, hey, we've already thought about this shared goal we're going to have, and we'd like you to be a part of it. Can you do it this year in the next 6 months? Because we put it on our thing 6 months ago and we're ready to go. But I think something that orchestrates the start and top of the funnel with as singular an idea set or like a prioritization mechanism, right? Again, customer, business results, KPIs, whatever, pick one, right? But I think you have to pick one.
Yeah. But how far in the organization should it span? Because is it just the customer experience organization? Is it everyone? I mean, in many cases, if this is not correctly implemented, like many decisions feel political, right? But in reality, they're just, we tried to do what we thought we were tasked with. Totally. We did our best. So how far do we need to go? Like, I mean, it's almost like nirvana to think like a company would be able to like do this and again at scale implement this. But where have you seen like this friction being resolved? Let me put it that way, like elegantly. Like, can you give an example?
Yeah, no. Because you're right, it is a dream. It is my dream. I dream about often. I mean, I can give you certain projects, right? Here's where I think that my dream derives. This is what I can give you. That I think when a objective supersedes I guess the rest of the hunting and pecking for the right work to do, then you get unification almost effortlessly. So, for example, we were looking at toxicity in gaming, right? That was it was and has been and is a problem in many games. And unfortunately, a lot of the times it's your most important players can be just as egregious in that activity because they're so passionate, right, about this game that they love. So, so sometimes new players come in, they're like, hey, get out, right? Or whatever, I mean, they are probably yelling at each other, much like my kids yell at each other when I think they're having fun, but I can't quite tell, and they're playing the game they love too. But I think there was a known understanding that toxicity actually degraded the experience, certainly for new players. So if we were trying to acquire new players, then you don't want a toxic environment being your front door, right? So we recognize that, but then it's how do we address that? What do we need to do? And our initial take on that was creating a cross-collaborative, cross-functional leadership team to help us assess what is the objective we've got, and what is the best way to work together to address the objective itself, and then we can disseminate
Around
individual
toxicity, like that was
around
a specific. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah.
exactly around a common shared objective with clarity, right? Here's toxicity. We know it's problematic. Now let's break it down into the things we can do as a team to address it. And then you have separate lanes, right? And it's okay to have separate lanes because we have to have some autonomy and independence in certain ways. But you start with a common objective first, and then you can make that separation. And then you have some sort of governance against to say, hey, is this thing the right thing to pursue? Here's what we're seeing. Here's what we're, addressing or testing or whatever it might be, and coming back to some guidance to find out, yes, this is worth going forward with or not. And I think there's at least some part. What my dream would be is there's some part of the organization that has like the one thing, right? The one thing that we need to focus on is this. And everything else is your business as usual. So separate those priorities. And this one thing, this is where we need everybody else. And if we need everybody else, then let's go talk to everybody about the one thing, one objective, and then break that down with each other so that we know how to execute it. That's what I would love to see. Now, everything else is, if it's relatively autonomous or like, hey, this is just a run the business kind of typical things to improve our functional area, great, have at it. Do it within the insulation of your own organization. But if you need a lot of cross-functional support, it's got to start in some other way.
It's like the code red for customer experience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, stop everything else. Like if it's code red, then this is the thing. I'm still a little bit curious about toxicity because it's very easy to understand. Like, I mean, it's hard to argue it. Toxicity is a problem, can lead to all these downstream effects that we don't want to have. Was that the case? Or because you mentioned acquisition is going to be a problem if you want to acquire new users and they land in like toxic gaming environments, that's obviously not going to help them retain. Was that a known thing? Like toxicity, big program, easy. Okay, let's put a cross-functional team together. You got it. You go. Or was it no? You really had to bake it into, oh, we have an acquisition problem, and I think, or here's my data that proves like toxicity might be one of the areas to put it in. Like just to make sure that I understand it correctly. Like what was the real starting point?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both, honestly. Like, I think it steeped my boss at the time, was steeped in this understanding that it was a big problem. Like we can see it in the customer service data all day long. Then it was about finding the partners who would agree that it's a problem. Security was a huge player in that, right? They already know that cheating and safe and fair play and those things are important, both for the company and for the players too. So how do we find the right partners who are going to have a common interest? So we found them, and then we started to pitch together. Like, what do you see? What do we see? Great. Let's bring that together and have a presentation or a proposal that is going to show how we need to address that. And then we talk to, and then there's just some, again, common sense, right? Like once you package it up and then you're putting it in front of somebody and saying, hey, look, all this happens. Here's the research. Here's our data. Here's what right? And here's what we think we can do about it. I think that's what kind of, greases the rails, right? It makes it easier to be like, oh, okay, all right, let's see what we can do to address this. Let's put somebody on it. Now, like a lot of companies, and I've seen this in so many different ways, and you try and do a big project like that on the side of your day job, right? So you are taking on a project in addition to all the other responsibilities you had, and you're really hoping that you can make a difference in that project. That's just hard, right? I mean, and we fought for focus too. We said, hey, we need real dedicated time. I need a dedicated, leader of some kind to be in charge of helping to orchestrate all of this from concept to execution. And, eventually we got it. I mean, it was one of the, we were able to bring in an amazing SVP to be responsible for that space after this program launched, because we knew how critical it was to the success of all of the games.
I love that. Really thinking about customer experience as a system and not as like a function or a department. So tell me, Charissa, like to end our conversation, which I think like was super fascinating to get a deep dive into your mind. So to leave us with one of your things, what will be the responsibility thinking about like building your next customer experience operating system in the next company, what's a responsibility you would never surrender and always keep to yourself? Like, and think about the ones that you could easily give away, but what is a responsibility that you would always like to have yourself?
I think it's the stewardship for the truth in that customer experience, right? And again, I think that's that's the journeys, that's the governance, that's the metrics, the rails of decision making. I think it's that I would never give that away. I think that is the piece that gets us closer to what a customer is feeling, thinking, needing. I think you can't make good decisions without having that understanding. I think that decision making process to identify those things well, I think just no, that's precious. Don't give that away. I would, on the things that I might leave, it's the maybe everything else, right? It's the execution details. It's the, it's making every fix your responsibility. It's not, I do think there's a importance in the relationship or in collaborating across the teams that help to execute against that stewardship. And I don't know about that. Sometimes I'm like, does it need to be in that team or not? Maybe, but I could see leaving it for the partnership, right, as an element of partnership. But yeah, keep all day long that proximity and understanding to the customer itself.
And so it is. Charissa, thank you so much for joining me today. You were fantastic.
Thanks. It was so nice to be here. I really appreciate it.
All right, and that's it. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable today, don't forget to subscribe to the Experience Edge on your favorite podcast channel, leave a review, and share it with your team. I'd be delighted. Today's episode was brought to you by TheyDo, the AI journey management solution for enterprise. To have an edge on your business strategy and to know why your customers do what they do, visit theydo.com and explore more resources to accelerate your customer experience game. And remember, the journey to creating customer-centric impact never ends, and here's always a new edge to discover in doing things differently. Next week, new episode. Until then, keep pushing the edge and stay inspired. See you in the next episode.